Good evening. Welcome to our talk. My name's Michael Marsh. I'm a professor of politics, and I'm here this evening representing the Policy Institute. And it's my pleasure to introduce, on behalf of the Policy Institute, Jonathan Chavez, to talk about probably some of the lesser recognized bits of public opinion research. Jonathan, I think, became known to us through connections following some meetings in Cambridge, Massachusetts last year. He's director of a company called Analytics, which sounds wonderful. I'd love to do analytics instead of just adding up numbers, which does a range of public opinion assessments, ranging from fairly conventional polls to some really quite highly sophisticated, and I think generally unknown in this state of the woods, exploring what it says on Facebook without having to read it. Since I have no access to Facebook because I'm not on it, that would be great for me because I wouldn't have to read it and I'd still find out what was there. He's done lots of work with Harvard universities and many other clients. He's going to talk anyway about at least some aspects of the American election. I did put it to him that it's a quiet period in the American election, and we have a little sort of election of our own here, which probably distracts a few people. But when the American election starts again in earnest, you'll be able to look back and draw on the information he's about to give you. So without more ado, Jonathan Chavez.
Just give me 1 second here while I get up the proper presentation. There we go. Everyone see it okay? Okay, great. So first off, I want to thank both the Policy Institute and Trinity College here for having me over. It's been a wonderful couple of days over here that I've got to spend in Dublin before heading up to Belfast pretty soon, and talking through some of these same things over there and coming to understand sort of, you know, a learning experience for me as well to understand the differences of what's going on in the Irish electorate compared to what we're seeing going on in America. Before I get started, I do want to apologize. I should not have titled my lecture at 2 a.m. If there's any confusion that I'll be talking about Fianna Fáil's role in the U.S. election, please leave now. It will not be involved in any way. But I do want to talk a little bit about social media and sort of the role it's playing in the United States election, some lessons that can be learned from that, and sort of just in general, the mentality of technology evolution, the role that it plays in politics, and how some of the lessons that we get out of the United States can be applied here, and to some extent how they can. So just as a means of overview, and wish I could read this. So United States politics in some ways has been a driving force behind the adoption of communications technology and innovation. Many of the most important sort of marketing techniques that we see as being commonplace. It's fine, I can get it done. Don't worry about it.
No, oh no, I don't explore it.
Anyway, many of the sort of common marketing techniques that we now accept to be commonplace in the world of marketing and the world of politics have their origins in U.S. campaigns, going back to the very beginning of the United States Republic, particularly when we saw the mass media revolution happen in the United States in the mid part of the 20th century. There are some reasons why this has been the case. First and foremost, the budgets that we have in United States presidential campaigns are enormous and blow everything else out of the water in terms of what we're competing with. It is estimated that in the 2012 campaign, the Republican and Democratic parties will spend about $3 billion combined on advertising and just sort of the general campaigning, which is just an enormous amount when you put it in context. In addition to that, the sort of reason that political sort of techniques and communication skills have an application to other forms of marketing is because in the world of politics, unlike in the world of trying to market products, you either win or you lose. There's no sort of squishy measures of maybe I sold more products, maybe I made more people aware. There is an explicit counter on the number of votes that you get. There is an explicit counter on the number of dollars that you raise through fundraising. And as such, having precise techniques are incredibly important when you're talking about $3 billion worth of campaigns. However, in adopting these technologies, there are often growing pains. New technologies often cause legacy and frictional adoption problems. These problems come when old mentalities are applied to new technologies. And historically, that's hampered the pace of growth. What I mean by this is that oftentimes, when you're sort of thinking about either advertising firms or political firms, it takes a while for these senior-most people to rise up through the ranks. The things that were sort of the state-of-the-art, cutting edge when they were coming up have bypassed them. And many of the sort of things that we see in technology flow and communications flow, the reason they occur is because they feel that there are fundamental gaps in not just the use of technology, but ways in which that technology can be incorporated into communication. And when you apply old mentalities to new technologies, you can often do more harm than good. So we're in the midst of one of these fundamental shifts in both technology and communication. The importance of social media to communications and public life should not and cannot be understated. It's the most fundamental communication shifts that's occurred, at least in my lifetime. I won't go as far as to say are, because I know we have varying ages in the audience, and there were some other technology and communication shifts that occurred before that were incredibly important as well. And last sort of point to make, though, is that some campaigns just get it, and those that don't might be doing themselves more harm than good. So failure to understand how to use these technologies can result in negative consequences. Every new technology and method of communication has rules, protocols, norms. Failure to follow these norms can cause harm, more harm than good, particularly in high-risk situations like politics. The lessons that we're going to sort of get out of the United States campaign can be applied to some campaigns in marketing abroad, but there are unique challenges that are faced in elections abroad compared to the United States that some of these things can't be applied. The main one to sort of call out here at first when we're sort of going through this is the amount of time that we have in United States campaigns is very, very different than the amount of time that most campaigns are waged in other places across the world. You know, we have essentially 2 years to wage a presidential campaign. The candidates were announcing in January of 2011. The campaign is going through November of 2012. When you have a new parliamentary election or a referendum election, it is an 8-week period that is sort of a quick rush to get things done. One of the sort of fundamental things about social media is that a lot of the things that we're going to sort of talk about, they take time. You can't instantaneously overnight build up trust with audiences that are critical to be successful in the realm of social media. Because of that, there are sort of new imperatives that particularly political parties have in the process of governance in using e-tools and new technologies to reach out and create relationships with constituencies. That is a very sort of different mentality from the United States. We saw a little bit of an example of this with Hollande's election in France. The people who were sort of running the social media side of his campaign came over from the Kennedy School at Harvard, were French expats who paid attention to some of the lessons of the Obama campaign and began working over a year ago to begin putting some of these things in place for the Socialist Party in France so that they could utilize these things effectively. So I just want to do a brief overview to sort of understand how the relationship between technology and communications-based technology and politics is not something that's explicitly new. I want to go back to JFK because besides just being me shamelessly pandering to the audience, JFK was a very, very important and critical figure in changing the way that communication-based technology was incorporated into US elections. He understood that he himself, when he was campaigning, was at another transition point in the history of media. He was going from a newspaper and strictly print-based system of media where you can go back and look at sort of the way in which newspapers worked then. They were sort of sliced off, individual constituencies had individual papers in which they looked at, to a mass media environment where people were consuming the same type of information from a variety of sources. It was a very big shift in the way in which you had to communicate with people. So starting in 1946 and going into 1952 when he ran in a Senate campaign, Kennedy's early entry into politics, they were marked by this fundamental understanding of this new media environment. He understood that first and foremost, image was important, and image was the most important thing when you were dealing in this multimedia environment. So you see back when he was running in 1946, this was incredibly rare in political campaigns to, at the time, put the candidate front and center on the poster like that. Prior to this, in United States campaign sort of advertising, you would tended to see just sort of campaign slogans broadcast across things. But in Kennedy and his father, to his credit, understood that with the era where images played a much more powerful role in psychologically influencing people in the way in which they viewed events, putting in a big image out there was very important. He also understood that blanketing the airwaves was to be done at all costs. Kennedy was a large subscriber to and understood the sort of theories that Walter Lippmann had on influencing public opinions, and understood that blanketing the airwaves, the more you said something, even if it was not necessarily true, you could convince people that it was by simply saying things over and over and over again. And the advantage of having money and blanketing the airwaves from an advertising context was something that he brought into politics explicitly. He also understood that it was important to get to know the voters, because even back then, the idea of sort of individual social networks being able to potentially harness them for your own good was something that could have benefits. So when we go to the 1960 election, there are really three things that he did that no one else had done before him. He was the first candidate to actually participate in the primaries and use the primaries as a method to try to win the election. Prior to him, it had been just sort of party bosses, smoke-filled rooms, trying to win them over. This was a fundamental mistake, actually, that Lyndon Johnson made in the 1960 election. Johnson assumed that this was an election that was going to be fought on the blinds of party bosses in the back room, making deals with the Democratic convention, never anticipated that Kennedy was going to be able to get enough delegates through the primary process, probably cost him the nomination that year, and probably was the thing that paved the way for Kennedy's election. He understood that harnessing the power of television was incredibly important as well. The 1960 presidential debates have sort of become famous as this sort of turning point in media and elections. Richard Nixon and his team treated the 1960 debates as essentially television being radio with pictures. What JFK realized is that images came first in television. It was something that our mind cognitively processed earlier. We were able to put a story before we put the words onto things by tone of voice and things like that, and put much, much more emphasis on how he looked than necessarily what he said. Finally, something that Kennedy does not get nearly enough credit for. He was the first president and the first presidential candidate to hire a pollster and have a pollster on staff. Lewis Harris, who was the founder of the Harris Organization, Harris Polling, Harris Interactive, all of that kind of stuff, he was Kennedy's pollster in the 1960 election. Kennedy brought him in, and he was a close, trusted advisor of coming to understand what was going on in the American electorate. The 1960 election was incredibly close, and what Kennedy used Harris for was to understand how to shift limited dollars to states that mattered most and campaign in the places that mattered most. So when you start looking at sort of the campaign expenditures that Kennedy did in his election, he came to understand that the two states that were likely going to be the tipping point states in that election were Illinois and Texas. Don't know if he legally won Illinois. I think that's an open question for debate. But he did put a lot of money and effort into campaigning in Illinois, and it was largely based on what he was seeing in the polling numbers coming out of Harris, of that being sort of the place where a tipping point was likely going to happen. So before we get into talk for a brief bit about how the social web came to be. I think it's easy to sort of have this notion that the social network film may have sort of promulgated that Mark Zuckerberg was sitting in his dorm room one day in 2004, and all of a sudden he just had this sort of brilliant strokey beard idea that we were going to come up with Facebook, and that sort of there were no precursors to that. That's not the case. I was sort of lucky and fortunate to be on campus at the time. Being member number 1200 or so of Facebook. And sort of there was a unique set of occurrences that were occurring on university campuses in America, particularly Harvard University campus, where you had a abundance of middle-class students who had grown up in a middle-class environment and had sort of unique, common, shared touch points of technology that influenced the way in which Facebook developed. So it didn't just happen subtly. For the past 20 years, technology has developed rapidly, while an explosion of social computing occurred in the middle part of the past decade. Events from the early 90s were integral. The millennial generation, essentially those of us under 30, and their relationships with technology have shaped the world and politics. Millennial generation, they've been the driving force behind much of this technology. We have an interesting and close relationship with technology through the years. So just want to sort of walk through this timeline a little bit to understand sort of how we got to where we are and the way in which our relationship with that computer sort of changed. There's a term that's sort of thrown out there of digital being a digital native or digital nativacy, of someone who has never sort of lived in a world where digital communication and sort of the computer has not been a central part of their life. It seems as though it may not be sort of that important of a sort of distinction to make, but it's actually critical in the way in which we view people viewing what technology is, should be, and how it can help solve problems in our lives. So going back to the early 1990s, in the United States there was a big push starting in the late 80s, but it really sort of took off in the early 90s to get computers into the classroom. Before that point, computers had been something that had been brought into sort of the business world, but in terms of sort of classroom usage, they were still on the old school, floppy disks. They were things that were used for explicitly either mathematical purposes, word processing purposes, and things like that. The push in the early 90s in the United States had the idea that getting people to sort of use technology was going to have broader benefits, and it shouldn't just be computer science was the relationship that people had. So you have many schools, and a couple states were more productive than others of doing this, of getting the ratio of computers to students in schools somewhere in the neighborhood of basically 4 to 1. For every 4 students, you would have 1 computer in the school building. We think about that now, and that seems primitive, but at the time, that was a sort of major advancement. And what that meant is that computers were no longer limiting resources. When I sat down in front of a computer in 5th grade, it wasn't as though someone else was waiting behind me to use that computer for a productive purpose. I had time to sit there with the computer and play this game called Oregon Trail, which, every American aged 25 to 35 knows this game. It's an old game where you play as a settler going over the mountains, trying to sort of get over to Oregon. You die of dysentery every 5 minutes in the game. But it's a game where that's our sort of first relationship with computers. We viewed them not as something that we're using to necessarily, just do sort of work processing, but it's work and sort of a personal sort of fun device that we have there. Fast forward to the middle part of the 1990s, really 1993 to 1995. We had a huge adoption rate of personal home computers in the United States, particularly among the middle class, because a series of developments made it much easier to have a ubiquitous platform. You first had Windows 95 come out that sort of drastically dropped the price of having a home computing environment that was universal, that someone who had never done any computer like programming or anything like that could understand how to use it and how to use it effectively. The Intel Pentium chips drastically dropped the price of computing, and the Intel chips is really sort of a turning point that we see in the price of personal computer chips of sort of, there's this rule of computing power doubles every 2 years or so. The Pentium chip is really sort of a touch point in that happening. You also saw in the mid-1990s companies like MSN, Prodigy, America Online, CompuServe, bringing relatively cheap internet communication into people's homes. Instead of computers being a sort of thing of isolation, where I sat down in front of my computer and I was zoning into this little box, the computer became something that connected me to the outside world, even in a very primitive way. In 1996, at least in the United States and around the world, things changed incredibly dramatically with the introduction of instant messaging. In the United States, it's AOL, abroad, MSN, those sort of things became fundamental parts of the way in which you see older millennials relating to computing, and it is one of these sort of most used programs that you'll see within sort of the computing environment. And the reason that this is sort of a very critical development is because one of the things to sort of understand about social media is that the term social media is a bit of a misnomer. Social media and social computing really is individualized media and individualized computing. What Instant Messenger allowed you to do is it essentially allowed you to leverage your peer networks so that physical place was no longer a limiting factor on your ability to have different peer network and peer conversations going on. Before instant messaging comes along, if I want to hang out with my friends, I had to choose an explicit and discrete set of friends to be in the same place with at the same time in order to have a conversation with them. If I have made that choice, I am not able to sort of make a choice of being with friend A, B, C, and D, while at the same time being with friend E, F, and G, if friend A, B, and C don't want to be with E, F, and G. Essentially that was probably way more confusing than it needed to be. Essentially, what I'm able to do with instant messaging is I am able to make a choice of having multiple conversations going on with multiple different sets of people at the same time. And in doing that, it put the individual more front and center in their choices of communication. And it made the computer something that was an inherently communicative device. It was no longer a device that was used for isolation. I could go home, I could spend 3 hours, I could have a conversation with 30 different friends and 10 different individual sets of friends and control that myself. Instant messaging gave that idea that that the computer could be something social, and when we see sort of much of the other developments that happen with social media, that idea was always baked in, that whatever is being done, the individual should be the central focus point that everything else is leveraged out from, instead of content necessarily being the central focus point that things are leveraged back to. Throughout the late 1990s, we saw some other developments in technology that were very important in the incorporation that we see into Facebook and into some of these other sort of technologies that were out there. Google, it really changed the way in which we relate to information. It's a constant source of frustration in my office of the young people and the older people there, the way in which we have our file structures set up. The way I set up my file structures on my computer is I save everything to my desktop. When my desktop gets really crowded, I just put a folder in there, say desktop whatever date it is, put all those files in there, and just file those things back. The reason I do that is I know that if by using the sort of search box on Apple, if I can think of an individual term that I used in a paper or something like that, I can put that term in there and that information will be readily accessible to me. It's not this idea of you need sort of the file structures in order to get there. There's been a number of studies out there of the change that search has done on the millennial mind, and the way in which sort of young people's minds are wired to process information is very, very different because of the way in which we've come to expect to be able to access content. Search and sort of the power of search has given us that idea that content should be something that is central. We should be able to find content in the way that we want to. And more importantly, in the late 1990s, we get the idea that we should also be able to control and own that content. Napster came along in 1999. A music file sharing site was relatively quickly shut down, but it got almost universal adoption among young people in the United States. One of the co-founders, Sean Parker, ended up going off to become one of the first chief executives over at Facebook. And music, and particularly file sharing, was a very, very early part of Facebook. After pictures and after the profile, the next development that Zuckerberg put into Facebook was something called Wirehog, which didn't ever make it off the Harvard campus, because essentially what Wirehog was is it would let you access your music library on Facebook and the music and video library of all of your friends, and essentially create a network where everyone that you know, you could share all of the information if you wanted to, and all of the content that you have on your machines. Music companies and film companies obviously threw a little bit of a hissy fit about this, and never made it past the first couple of days. But it was integral to the just sort of very DNA of the way that Facebook was set up, that content should be king, and content sharing was something that was going to be important. And content curation, more importantly, was something that was there. MySpace in the early 2000s is founded as well, and proves that social networks can be used. Up until about 2008, MySpace was the more used social network in the United States. Facebook did not become the most used social network until about 2008. MySpace essentially fell off the face of the map at that point. One of the reasons that MySpace collapsed as quickly as it did is because there was a growing divide, educational divide, between those who were using MySpace and those who were using Facebook. If you looked at someone on MySpace, they, by and large, were non-college graduates, had never been to college. Facebook were either college graduates or people who were likely to attend college. Twitter comes along in 2006, and it fills a role that Facebook did not do very well. In spite of Facebook trying to curate content, Facebook didn't allow you to explicitly curate the information that was coming into your news stream. Instead, they put algorithms on top of it and said, we're going to do a good job of figuring out what your interests are and put things into the news stream. And still to this day, when you look at your news stream and your wall on Facebook, you just have to ask yourself, why does Facebook think I want to hear from this person? You know, I haven't seen them in 20 years. I don't care about their dog. I really don't. Twitter understood that, and understood that that was a fundamental flaw, and ends up developing itself that essentially what Twitter is, when people sort of ask me to explain it, it is a personalized, curated news stream of both your personal life and the public information that you want to get. It allows you to seamlessly integrate your close friends as well as major media organizations into something where you get it there. If someone is publishing information you don't like on Twitter and it's just not useful for you, you unfollow them. You know, it's as simple as that. And so, you know, we can get, you know, for me, Kanye West, his Twitter feed is awesome and provides some sort of great insight into someone looking for Persian rugs with cherub imagery. If that's not your thing, you can sort of cut it off, and I have that choice, and it turns it over to me. Twitter arises out of Facebook not necessarily having that. Just wanted to throw up sort of the iPhone here as well as sort of where we're seeing computing heading. As I said earlier, the idea of social computing is a bit of a misnomer. Social computing and social media is actually individualized computing and individualized media and curating things for yourself. What the mobile phone and sort of very powerful smart devices allow you to do is that mobile thing essentially becomes an extension of the individual and puts you into space, right? It puts you into a physical environment, and you're able to relate to that physical environment in ways that we were not able to do before. That's where we're seeing sort of technology trending and heading. Zuckerberg himself has said in Facebook that you know, mobile is where their big focus is going to be coming up, because I think people understand that that's where the large market is. It's where the market in China is, frankly, and when you look at sort of tech organizations, they're looking at the rise of a Chinese middle class as the immediate place where they're going to be finding dollars in the near term. In the same way that you saw many sort of developing countries bypass landline telephones in favor of mobile telephones, at least sort of initial mobile telephones, you are seeing a lot of those countries as well bypass standard terminal computing in favor of mobile computing as the primary way in which they're using computer devices. It's a more individualized way of doing things. It presents unique challenges, though. So, brief is a bit of a misnomer there, sorry about that. To understand how to use new technology, you must understand where it came from and how it came to be. Facebook, Twitter, and other social media platforms tried to fill needs that directly related to shortcomings that their developers, millennials, had come to see in other technology products. Really important thing to sort of note here, that sort of if I had like 2 or 3 takeaways from this entire thing, I think this is one of the more important ones. We spend a lot of time focusing on the way that technology shapes the way that we live. Right? You can go into any bookstore and find a series of professors and many old curmudgeons at times talking about sort of technology shaping the way in which we relate to one another. We don't spend nearly enough time, though, thinking about the way that people live shaping the technology development. In spite of what we like to think about them as, programmers are the environment around them. They are reacting to fill needs that they feel technology is not filling in the way in which people are trying to use computing. So when we think about sort of the way in which technology is developing, asking ourselves how does people shaping technology is important to think about as well. So with that in mind, and this is sort of a brief detour before we sort of bring these two things together and look specifically at the 2012 election, I want to look at the development of internet-based technologies on US politics and how this really started in 2000 and it's come to the present. Fundamental question is, why are some campaigns better at using social media and generally the internet than others? And what lessons can be learned from their successes and failures? Just like analyzing the current state of social media requires understanding sort of what's happened over the past 12 years, understand this, want to go back to 2000. Two broad themes are going to be at play here as we sort of go through this. Using the internet in politics, there are two things that using the internet in politics that campaigns have learned to do really well and it can be really effective at. One is internet-based data generates a ton of data in an enormous database that smart people and political scientists can really sort of delve into and utilize to be much more effective about the ways that they campaign is first thing. Second thing is these technologies help organizations establish relationships. Even if they're not real relationships, they do a better job of sort of individualizing those relationships in ways that were not present before. When we look at sort of success and failure on this timeline, one of the sort of interesting thing to note is that the Republican success are when they use tools to try to do a better job of showing that they had a personality. And Democrats tended to do a better job when they understood they could use tools to help them be organized. And in many ways, those are, broadly speaking, gross oversimplification, the tragic flaws of the two parties. Democrats don't know how to organize anything. Republicans are bland and personalityless. The extent to which they are able to use technology, they're able to incorporate that in. So I want to go back to each of the elections that we see between 2000 and 2010 to understand how the internet has evolved into a social realm within US politics. So starting in 2000, John McCain actually was a major innovator in the realm of the use of internet in political campaigning. He was the first campaign to explicitly use email as a fundraising device. In 2000, by May 29th of that campaign, McCain had raised 25% of the total he had raised, $10 million. Keep in mind we're at $1 or $3 billion this time around, had come from email donations. George Bush's campaign, it was less than 3% was coming from email donations. McCain understood the web could be used for a specific campaign for purpose and not just marketing. He used personalized emails to establish what looked like primitive relationships with voters. So the advantage that email gave him is that it drastically cut down the structural cost of having a piece of communication with someone else. Prior to email, if you wanted to communicate with voters, you had to either print signs, send out sort of direct mail targeting and things like that. There was a limited number of sort of individualized things that you could do with that because the physical cost of printing things, the physical cost of making these things, meant that you had to make an investment in this. With email, the only investment you had is the time to actually sort of compose the email. You were able to micro-target sort of down, and that's something that we'll get into a little bit more in 2002. But what McCain was able to do is he was able to sort of say, by utilizing email, I am able to figure out specifically the person I'm trying to email and give them a message that is tailored to them specifically. In 2002, the Republicans used something that was called voter vault, that had been an obsession of Karl Rove's since the early 1990s, and the Republican National Committee finally utilized it effectively in the 2002 campaign. The traditional cycle in American politics is that after the president wins their election, the midterm election for Congress 2 years out, the party in power loses seats. happens almost without fail. You look at the 2010 election and the 2010 midterms, the Democrats lost seats after that. 2006 after 2004, the Republicans lost seats, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. 2002, the Republicans managed to buck that trend. Now, absolutely part of that was the political environment that was going on in the United States at the time. There was a rally around the flag mentality. We tend to vote for the party in power during those times of rally around the flag. However, 2002 and really in 2004, voter vault had a really big role in the Republicans turning out more votes. And the polls in 2004 actually were some of the more inaccurate ones we've seen in U.S. political polling in recent times. There have been a couple of anomalous cases. The New Hampshire primary in 2008 was a huge anomaly in polling that if you want to sort of get into that, we can talk through the specifics of the underrepresentation of working class voters in New Hampshire electorates, particularly around the Massachusetts border. I don't think we want to get into that right now though, but what they were able to do with voter vault is they took the principles that McCain had in 2000, and in 2002 and 2004, what voter vault was, is it essentially amalgamated all of the lists that every Republican in the country had. Every senator, every representative, every state party, the Republican National Committee. And you know, it seems sort of simple to us. We would think, well, obviously, wouldn't they all sort of have this? No. Candidates in political parties in the United States do a terrible job of communication, a terrible job of coordination. Some of that is because of legal reasons. They have to sort of keep bright lines between what they're doing because of fundraising and things like that. But what Voter Vault did is it created the largest database of Republican voters, and it had their voting behavior, donation behavior, candidates they had supported in the past, you know, open rates of emails that they had, so that what Rove and Republicans were able to do in 2002 and 2004, they were able to target, and micro-target is a term that they used, the most sort of effective messages for getting out the vote, fundraising and things like that, by taking people's sort of engagement with email and putting it into a large database. 2004 was really a tipping point in US elections with the Howard Dean campaign. There was a point in late November, early December of 2007 where it was not unreasonable to say that Howard Dean was the favorite to win the Democratic nomination for president, which beginning of 2007 was almost unheard of. I see the yeah going on up there, exactly. You know, but that's sort of a critical sort of point to make. What Howard Dean sort of failed on is what Howard Dean did is he made the internet front and center of his campaign. It was the lifeblood of what he was doing. Everything had online organization as first and foremost the way in which he was communicating with people. Howard Dean would sit down on the Dean for America website and he would actually blog. He would respond to people's comments. He made himself seem as a politician that was not out of touch with people, and even if he wasn't able to respond to thousands of people, people simply thought that he was listening. What Dean also did is he was really effective at understanding that fundraising could be done online, but you had to be explicit about asking for it. It couldn't just be sort of this generic fundraising message. I had the sort of fortune of working with one of Dean's chief tech people, a guy named Nico Mille, who is at the Kennedy School right now at Harvard, who was the sort of webmaster for the Howard Dean campaign. And the reason that Howard Dean was so effective at fundraising was as simple as people like to see things filled up. So what Howard Dean did is when he had to do campaign fundraising at the end of the month, he would literally put either a thermometer or a baseball bat on the front page of his website and say, I'm trying to get to this amount of money. Here's the amount of money that I have right now. Help me get there. Was the single most effective fundraising tool that the Howard Dean campaign had. Seems very, very simple, but they understood that if they were testing this stuff and doing data analytics on it, they would be successful and could be successful. Dean's ultimate demise, though, showed that turning online action into offline results can be really, really hard work. Where the Dean campaign failed is they failed to transition all of this excitement and activity into actual voters in the Iowa caucuses. About a week prior to Iowa, he sent out a bunch of his volunteers to Iowa to try to organize the caucuses. Bunch of shaggy-haired, bearded college students wearing orange hats that said Dean for America, knocking on corn farmers' doors saying, are you going to come out and support my candidate? not the most effective method at sort of utilizing these things. And this is something that the Obama campaign, and many of the people who worked on the Obama campaign, worked on the Dean campaign, realized was a fundamental misunderstanding. What the Obama campaign realized is that social media and online interactions are most effective when they are coming from relationships of trust. I am going to be more likely to respond to someone that I know than someone that I don't know. 2006 was the dry run for the Obama campaign. Our governor of Massachusetts, Deval Patrick, he went from less than 1% name recognition a year and a half before the election to winning the election with over 65% of the vote by spending almost no money in television advertising and doing everything in terms of sort of online interactions. What the Patrick campaign realized and what their sort of idea was is, first and foremost, the more people that have access to data, the better. And we should allow people to do the communications on our behalf because they're going to do a better job. So what the Patrick campaign did, this is a first in US politics. They put their database, their voter database, online. Anyone could go in there and look at their sort of list of supporters that the Patrick campaign had. So you would be able to log in sort of information about how often that person had been contacted, who had contacted them, etc. So you were able to go into go onto the Patrick website, log in. You would then be able to search for friends of yours in Massachusetts and see, had this person been contacted? Did the Patrick campaign consider them a supporter or not? It allowed you as an individual to sort of almost create your own walk list of people that you were going to advocate on behalf of for Governor Patrick. It was an incredibly, incredibly successful method, and you just saw his numbers sharply rise during the polls. The Patrick campaign was run by David Axelrod and David Plouffe, who explicitly used, and you know, the sort of first commercial that the Patrick campaign run was the power of hope. The campaign message of it is "Together we can." Those of you who remember the Obama campaign message, it was "Yes we can." He was an African American from the south side of Chicago who went to Harvard Law School. I mean, it really was just you go back and look at the campaign, it was an explicit dry run for what happened with Obama. Obama in 2008 solved a lot of the problems that Howard Dean had by using some of the methodologies that Deval Patrick had. There was a famous quote where at the Jefferson-Jackson dinner in Iowa in October, I believe, or November of 2007, Obama had turned out, 15,000 young people to his speech and, energized the crowd. After the event, media organization asked Mark Penn, who was Hillary Clinton's chief pollster and chief strategist, what he thought about the event. And what Mark Penn said is, "I'm not worried. Our voters look like caucus goers. His voters look like Facebook." The Clinton campaign won voters over 30 in the Iowa caucus by about 6 points. They lost voters under the age of 30 by 50 points. It was the tipping point in the election. Obama wins Iowa by 6 points. It catapults him off to sort of the election. Obama gets credit for being sort of digitally savvy, having a Facebook page before many of the other candidates did, being one of the first candidates to put himself on Twitter. The single most effective, and you talk with the Obama people, the single most effective thing they did in terms of utilizing technology in that election was they put together an iPhone app that took the idea of Patrick turning over the voter database and put it into your hands. So what the Obama iPhone app did, and mobile phone app did, you could log into it, and it would give you, it would go through your contact book, and it would look for friends of yours that lived in swing states. Look at the area codes, identify area codes by where they are, and say, here is a list of your friends who are living in swing states. Here are your friends that live in swing states that haven't been contacted. Do you want to call them on behalf of the Obama campaign? And then would have a script that would be there that you could talk through them and talk to them. And then it would catalog that, put that back into the database so that the next time someone else logged in, they would be able to see who was contacted, where they were, and all of that kind of stuff. So they understood that the whole point of this was turning power back over to the people, giving it and establishing relationships of trust, what was going to be most successful. 2010, the Republicans They were the party that figured out Twitter much quicker than the Democrats did. By a ratio of 4 to 1, 4 times as many Republicans are active on Twitter in terms of congressional members than Democrats. They understood that Twitter as a news stream source could be really, really effective at creating an echo chamber, and the Republicans have done a really good job of using Twitter for that. So, in summary of this part, successful uses of the internet in politics have done 3 things. They've treated each new tool on its own terms, using it for its best use, not just using it because it's the newest tool. They've translated action online into votes and donations offline, and they've kept data and analytics front and center and used the internet to both generate data and harness the data that they have. So looking at the 2012 campaign, 2011 and early 2012 saw a hotly contested Republican primary. Each major candidate attempted to use social media effectively. They've all failed. And thus far, President Obama has done a pretty bad job of using sort of social media and just online media in general. I want to walk through each of the campaigns and go through specific tactics that they've used. Some of these, you're going to look at them and say they couldn't have actually done that. I assure you that everything in here, the campaigns actually did. So Newt Gingrich. Gingrich has 1.4, at this point maybe close to 1.5 million followers on Twitter. Far more than any of the other Republican candidates. Part of the reason is because Gingrich's campaign is based on being a campaign of big ideas that's funded in the grassroots and has support of the people. Of Gingrich's 1.4 million Twitter followers, 66% of them follow no one else. And have no followers themselves. Essentially what Gingrich did is Gingrich said to his campaign staff, I need Twitter followers. Twitter followers are the grassroots. If I have the most Twitter followers, I'm the candidates of the grassroots. His campaign staff said, okay, we'll get you Twitter followers. There are firms out there and there are people out there who their only job is just getting you Twitter followers, and there's sort of nothing behind them. There are people who just say, you follow me on Twitter, I'll follow you. The Gingrich campaign went out and got those people, got to 1.4 million followers, but there's absolutely no impact of that other than to say, I have 1.4 million followers. You look at sort of metrics of engagement and things like that. He never got anything sort of out of that. It's the old media mentality that just sort of the top line number is what's important, instead of looking at sort of why this tool arose that led Gingrich to make that fundamental mistake. Ron Paul and why you should almost never trust internet polls. So Ron Paul is in some ways the right's version of Howard Dean. Ron Paul, he's been effective at becoming a candidate of the people online. During the campaign, he's effectively used these things called what he calls money bombs to fund his campaign. Basically what he says is, today we're going to have a money bomb. I want to show that we have a base of activity behind us. Save all your donations this month. Donate them all on this day so I can say I got $10 million on this day. Whenever you look at just sort of levels of social activity online, it's sort of hard to see the numbers here, and I apologize for that. But it's a Washington Post tracker of the number of mentions of each candidate from Twitter that happens on a weekly basis. Ron Paul is in first place with 219,000 mentions on Twitter on a weekly basis. Barack Obama is in second place with 71,000 mentions on Twitter on a weekly basis. People who like Ron Paul really like Ron Paul. They talk about him all the time. They assume you want to hear about him all the time. Even if you're just sort of sitting there at dinner, they just want to keep talking about him. However, Ron Paul never effectively translated these things into offline action because, as Howard Dean realized, getting passionate voters to connect with people who don't share your own mentality can be really tough to do. The Ron Paul people talk to themselves. They didn't talk to other people. He did the exact same thing that Dean did. He shipped in volunteers to Iowa and hoped that shipping in volunteers to Iowa was going to get him the votes that he needed. It did not work at all. He ended up coming in a disappointing third place in Iowa behind Rick Santorum and Mitt Romney. Skipping over Rick Santorum, I don't have a slide on him, but if you want to look at why he failed in this campaign, just Google the word Rick Santorum and you will see why. Okay. Rick Perry and the outdated influencer model. So before I say this, I again, completely true. Before the 2012 election, Rick Perry and his campaign team in American political circles were known as the most sophisticated operation on the Republican side. They were feared for their ruthlessness and their ability to incorporate hard political science into what they were doing. There's an ebook up here by Sasha Eisenberg called Rick Perry and His Eggheads. 20 pages long. If you're interested in this stuff, I actually encourage you to read it. Basically what it details is that in the 2006 Republican primary in the Texas gubernatorial campaign, what Rick Perry and his campaign team did is, outside of the two largest media markets in Texas, they turned over all advertising, radio and television, to a group of political scientists from Yale, and essentially said, we want you to do A/B testing and multivariate testing, and we're doing daily tracking to try to figure out what things had an impact on polling. Were there different messages that did a better job of resonating with voters on a daily basis? Did the number of points you put behind a radio ad have an effect on it? And what the sort of conclusion of the data they had is that advertising had almost no effect on gubernatorial elections, that sort of doing mass broadcasts had no effect. The only effect that you really saw a bump in is when the candidate actually appeared at a local event and got local news coverage. They would see daily tracking number fluctuations as a result of that. So what they pursued is what they called an influencer social media strategy, where they would go after people that they thought were influential in social media, try to influence them, become friendly with them, and obviously all of the followers of that person would sort of fall in sort of their wake and sort of believe what they had to say. So they reached out to a couple people, this guy named Eric Erickson. He runs a website called Red State, which is one of the sort of most prominent conservative blogs out there in American politics. If you want to get sort of an insight into the American Republican mindset, go there. It can be a scary place, so just as sort of a pre-warning on that. He reached out to him, to this woman named Michelle Malkin, etc., and got them to basically be his supporters. It became very, very obvious very early on that they had been paid by the Perry campaign, though, and they were shilling for them. And you would go into the comments section of these things, and you would see people saying that, you've sold out to Rick Perry, you've abandoned the principles that made your blog good. So, reasons for failure: inability to establish real trust with these grassroots voters, and the failure to use this presidential data correctly. What he really didn't understand is that gubernatorial elections are very different from presidential elections, that you're fighting them on a much larger scale, and just like Rick Perry, I can't remember that third reason. Mitt Romney, why authenticity matters online. So Romney campaign, it's been doing everything, in the same way that you would expect a consultant to do everything very well. They've checked all the boxes. They have a Facebook page. They update it regularly. They have a Twitter feed. They're on Instagram. Like all of the things you're supposed to do in social media, they have. When you have a candidate, though, who can't establish relationships with people offline, it's really hard to establish relationships with people online. So in spite of the fact that Mitt Romney has over 1.6 million likes on Facebook, he gets less engagement on many of his posts than candidates with 1/10 the number of likes that he has. 1.6 million likes. The sort of photo that he put up of sort of him talking in front of an oil rig, it's sad that in American politics this is a good thing, but 648 out of 1.6 million people like that. Incredibly, incredibly low numbers comparatively when you benchmark it on stuff on Facebook. So Romney's yet to use his social media to show voters who he is. Most of his posts at this point are simply posts of daily events, top-down communications, and communications that are not looking to engage voters. To improve, Romney can focus on engagement and establishing relationship with voters and trying to express some personality on these social media sites. The Obama campaign and why I dread the end of every month. So again, Obama did a very good job of sort of establishing the relationships over the course of the 2008 campaign. However, at this point, the only relationship I have with the Obama campaign are the multiple emails a day I get from him and other Democrats asking for campaign donations. I have 3 emails right there, all addressed to Jonathan, thankfully, from April 30th from the Obama campaign. Literally, they're emailing you at the end of the month 3 to 5 times to ask you for solicitations. They're doing nothing in terms of trying to establish relationships with people. They are simply viewing at this point their online media operation in terms of what you look at their Twitter feed and what they're doing on Facebook. It's all about fundraising. 2008, Obama campaign used online tools to let his campaign connect to voters and let voters connect with their own friends. As the Obama campaign gets into full gear this year, putting that voter connection at the center of the voter strategy can potentially get back some of the excitement he may have lost. So just summary and conclusions before I sort of turn it over to the floor and we have some wide-ranging discussions, I'm sure. Political campaigns and really marketing initiatives, you want to go broader. To succeed, they need to follow the process that we at sort of the company I work for at Social Sphere, the heart of all online activity. We have this sort of 3-step process. We call it identify your most passionate supporters and stakeholders, empower them with a combination of technology and respect, and ask them for more, because talking online and liking someone on Facebook is never enough. So in the context of political campaigns, the identification is to be successful at using social media in politics and marketing, PR, any field. You must put relationships front and center and use social media to establish engagement, not just blast messages. To do that, you have to identify who your most important relationships are. There are many ways of doing this. There are many sort of organizations out there that will help you do this. There are simple ways of doing that, but identifying those people is a critical first step. Second is empowering them. Only by harnessing and effectively using that data and putting it in the right tools in the hands of the right people. Capture the data, structure the data, leverage it is something that the successful campaigns have done, and they've turned over more power to individual people. Finally, asking for more. In politics, asking for more means orienting your campaign around offline activity. If someone does not have a link to more votes, more donations, more volunteers, it may be a bad use of time. Use social media to ask your most passionate advocates to translate that passion into action. Final slide is the implications and why Europe is a little bit different. US elections, again, we have much more time to establish these relationships, 2 years. This identification process, it can't happen overnight. You can't establish trust with someone overnight. You have to build that relationship. You have to communicate and show that you're wanting to connect with people. That takes time. And the only way to get that time is to constantly work at focusing social media practice around the idea of establishing relationships so that when time comes for action, you're trusted and can have the impact that you want. It sounds simple. It's hard to operationalize. Smart campaigns have done it. In 2012, there's still an opportunity for some of the smart campaigns to do it. And over here in Europe, there's absolutely an opportunity for some of the political parties and campaigns to utilize some of these tools to effectively establish some of these relationships. So with that, I will turn it over to the floor.